All right, so get this. Shanghai, China. They consistently rank #1 globally on those PISA tests, for math, reading, and science. #1. It's a bit mind-blowing when you really think about it. But, and here's where things get interesting, is this incredible academic success. I mean, top of the charts globally. Is it coming at some kind of hidden cost? Are students maybe having to sacrifice a deeper understanding, creativity, or even like their own well-being just to get these amazing scores? Today, we're going deep.
It really is a bit of a puzzle, isn't it? You have these exceptional results, at least as far as these international rankings are concerned, yet there's this constant kind of undercurrent of concern about the wider developmental picture, about what it's truly like to be a student in this kind of system.
It kind of forces you to ask, what does it really mean to be successful in education?
Exactly, and that's precisely what we're going to explore today.
We're taking a deep dive into Chinese education, but we're doing it through this really fascinating lens. And that lens is something called self-determination theory, or SDT for short. Now, you can think of SDT as a framework for understanding human motivation, what really drives us, what makes us feel engaged, and ultimately what helps us to grow.
Yeah, it's a way of looking at those core psychological needs that really fuel our development.
So our mission here is to use SDT to try and uncover what's really driving this educational machine in China, and to see if those impressive PISA scores, maybe, have a flip side, a side that's not so visible when you just look at the rankings, a side that might have some real implications for how students are actually feeling and developing.
If we think about it from a basic human psychology perspective, SDT proposes that for us to truly thrive, to grow and flourish, we need to have these three fundamental psychological needs met. The first one is autonomy.
Autonomy.
Yep. And that basically boils down to feeling like you're in control of your own choices and actions. Then you have relatedness.
Our need to connect, right? To feel like we belong.
Exactly, that sense of having meaningful relationships with others, of feeling connected. And then the third need is competence.
So feeling like you're good at things, that you can achieve what you set out to do.
Precisely, that feeling of being effective and capable. Now, ideally, education should be an environment that actually supports and nurtures these needs.
Think back to your own school days for a moment. You probably had those classes where you felt super motivated, where you were really engaged and excited to learn. And then there were probably others. Well, not so much. Maybe you even compared your own experiences to stories you've heard about schools in other parts of the world. I know I have.
Absolutely. We've all wondered what makes certain educational approaches work better than others.
And that's where this deep dive comes in. We're going to offer you a completely new way of looking at this, using the principles of SDT as our compass. But before we even jump into the heart of Chinese education, we need to address this really important question. Can we even use a theory like SDT, which has its roots in Western psychology, to understand students in a cultural context like China?
It's a valid question. I mean, is the need for autonomy, for example, something universal, or does it play out in fundamentally different ways depending on the culture? That's where we're going to start by looking at the research to see if this SDT framework holds up, if it can really give us valuable insights when we apply it to this very specific context.
From there, we're going to zoom in on what you might call the powerhouse of Chinese education. That high-stakes testing system, the Gaokao. It's kind of legendary, right? We're going to put on our SDT glasses and really dissect it. We'll look at the arguments people make in its favor, and then we'll unpack the sometimes pretty harsh criticisms.
And of course, we can't forget about the key players in all of this, the parents and teachers.
Right, those who are right there in the trenches, shaping the experience of the students.
Exactly. So we'll analyze the roles they play, their approaches, and how the whole Gaokao system influences all of that.
And finally, we want to understand why, despite all the attempts at reform over the years, things haven't really fundamentally changed. What would a more holistic, a healthier model of Chinese education look like? One that truly puts the well-being and development of students at the center, alongside academic achievements. So let's jump right in. Let's talk about the Gaokao. Paint a picture for us. What exactly is this exam?
The Gaokao, which literally means higher education entrance examination, is basically the national college entrance exam in mainland China. It happens every year, organized by the Ministry of Education, and for the vast majority of students, it's like the grand finale of their high school years. But what makes it so different, so intense, is the sheer weight it carries. The stakes are incredibly high, probably more so than any other exam in the world. This isn't just a test, it's a life-defining event for many.
High stakes.
Yeah.
That almost feels like an understatement when you hear people talk about it. I've read descriptions of it as.
Right. You hear things like the test that can determine the course of your life, which kind of sums up the whole atmosphere around it.
And that really reflects a whole different educational philosophy, right? It's like a completely different way of thinking about exams.
Absolutely. In many East Asian education systems, including China, exams are often seen as a way to select, to filter, to rank students. It's what we call assessment for selection. You're basically measuring how much knowledge students have accumulated, but primarily for the purpose of sorting and categorizing them.
It's like a giant sorting hat, deciding your destiny.
In a way, yes. And this is in stark contrast to the more common approach in Western education, which often emphasizes assessment for learning.
Where the focus is more on giving feedback and helping students to keep learning and improving.
Exactly. In that model, the test is a tool for growth, not just a gatekeeper.
Yeah.
But in the Gaokao system, well, the consequences are pretty far-reaching, right?
It's not just about getting into any college, it's about getting into the right college. And that could have a huge impact on someone's whole life.
For sure. Admission to a top university, particularly through a good Gaokao score, is incredibly important in China. It's directly linked to better job opportunities, a higher income, even social status. And this effect is amplified by the fact that China has these huge economic disparities between rural and urban areas. So, for many students who come from rural backgrounds, doing exceptionally well on the Gaokao is seen as the only way out, the golden ticket to a better life.
I mean, that's a lot of pressure to put on a single exam.
Oh, absolutely. And it gets even more complex because the competition isn't even the same across the country. The minimum score you need to get into a specific university can actually vary quite a lot depending on which province you're taking the exam in. And guess what? Provinces with more rural students, they often have higher cutoff scores.
So on top of everything else, rural students often have to score even higher to get into the same university.
Exactly. Talk about pressure. And this system, this whole idea of high stakes testing, it's not some new invention. It's deeply woven into Chinese history and culture.
It's like it's in their DNA.
Well, in a way, yes. The Gaokao is actually a direct descendant of the Keiju, the imperial examination system. And that system was used for centuries, going all the way back to around 600 AD, to select officials for the government. So for a very long time, these nationwide exams, they essentially shaped the entire social hierarchy. And that legacy is still very much alive in Chinese culture, you know.
You can see it in their proverbs and sayings.
Oh, absolutely. Like, all professions are lowly, only the study of books is noble, or excel in learning and then serve. Even today, you'll hear things like scores determine destiny, Gaokao changes life. They even compare the exam to 10,000 horses and soldiers trying to cross a single log bridge. It really captures that feeling of intense competition.
So we've got this picture of the Gaokao, this incredibly high-pressure system. Now let's put on our SDT glasses and analyze it. How does this system, with its emphasis on external rewards and intense competition, impact those core psychological needs that we talked about earlier?
Well, when you look at it through the lens of SDT, the most striking feature of the Gaokao is its external orientation. It fosters what we call a controlling motivational climate. It's all about achieving those external rewards, meeting those external expectations, rather than cultivating a love for learning itself. And this is even reflected in, like, ancient texts meant to motivate students.
Really?
Oh, yeah. There's this poem for motivating learning that actually emphasizes things like golden mansions and beautiful women as the ultimate goals of studying. It frames learning as a means to an end, a way to get those rewards, rather than something enjoyable and valuable in its own right.
So it's all about the destination, not the journey. Get those good grades, get into that top university, and then you'll be successful. You'll have a good life. But what about the process of learning itself?
Exactly. When the stakes are so high and the whole system is built around this single exam, it's very likely that students will start seeing learning as just a way to get those external rewards or avoid punishment. It becomes a chore, something you have to do, not something you want to do.
And that really undermines their autonomy, right? That feeling of being in control of their own learning.
Absolutely. It's like their intrinsic motivation gets hijacked by this massive external pressure. And when we look at the research, it's no surprise that a huge proportion of Chinese students say they mainly study to prepare for exams, and this tendency just keeps increasing as they move through school.
I mean, when you think about it, they're spending years and years preparing for this one exam, the Gaokao. So in a way, it's like their entire educational experience is being shaped by this external pressure.
Exactly. And it's not even just about getting good grades for the sake of good grades, right? There are all these other external pressures at play.
Pleasing parents, impressing teachers, fitting in with peers. It's a lot to handle.
Totally. So many students, they say their main reasons for studying are to please their parents, to gain respect from teachers and classmates, to get that high ranking in the class. And even when they go to extra tutoring, it's often not because they actually want to learn more. They might be doing it because their parents expect it or because everyone else is doing it. It's like this massive pressure cooker of external expectations.
And that kind of environment,
Yeah.
it doesn't really foster a growth mindset, does it?
Not really. It can lead to what we call a closed mindset, where students are less open to new ideas, less willing to take risks, more afraid of making mistakes. And of course, it leads to a lot of anxiety, constant internal pressure.
And to that failure avoidant motivation, it's all about not messing up, rather than striving for genuine mastery.
Exactly. It becomes about avoiding those negative consequences rather than pursuing a deep love for the subject.
It's like they're so focused on not falling behind, they forget to look up and see where they actually want to go.
It's almost like they're on this treadmill, running and running, but not really choosing their own direction.
And in all of this, it seems like they're missing out on a really crucial part of development, figuring out who they are, what they're passionate about.
Absolutely. That's a huge cost. With all this focus on exam preparation, students often have very little time or space to explore their own interests, to figure out what they're good at, to develop a strong sense of their own identity.
Like they haven't had a chance to develop their own internal compass.
Precisely. There's this really interesting research showing that a surprisingly large number of students, even as they're approaching the Gaokao, still haven't figured out what they're really passionate about.
They don't know what they want to study, what kind of career they want to pursue, what activities they actually enjoy. They're just so focused on getting through this exam.
Exactly. And this lack of a clear sense of self, of their own internal motivation, it can make things really difficult for them once they actually leave the Gaokao system, once they enter university.
It's like they've been so used to being told what to do, how to think, how to study, that they don't really know how to function without that external pressure.
Exactly. And, SDT research suggests that the negative effects of this controlling environment, they might actually become even stronger once that external control is removed.
It's like a rubber band snapping back.
It's a good analogy. Think about it. If your motivation is primarily based on external rewards or punishments, what happens when those rewards and punishments are no longer there?
You lose your steam. You don't know what to do with yourself.
Right. So a student who's been studying for the Gaokao, mainly to avoid disappointing their parents, they might suddenly feel totally lost and unmotivated in college where the pressure is off. And because they haven't really developed a strong sense of their own identity, they might feel adrift, unsure of what they want to do with their lives.
Like they've reached the finish line, but they don't know where to go next.
It's a real possibility. And this can lead to a few different outcomes. Some students might just disengage.
They just check out.
Yeah, they lose interest in their studies, maybe even rebel against academic pursuits as a way of pushing back against years of feeling controlled.
Like they're finally reclaiming their autonomy.
It could be interpreted that way, but there's also the possibility that this prolonged exposure to such a controlled system might actually shape their personalities in a way that makes them seek out similar structures even later in life.
So they're kind of conditioned to function in a very specific way.
Exactly. This could explain why we see things like a high prevalence of materialism, a desire for stability and hierarchy, a preference for very structured careers, even after they've left the Gaokao system. It's like they've internalized those values of control and external validation.
Okay, so the Gaokao might be restricting their autonomy, both during those crucial high school years and potentially even later in life. Now let's talk about the second core need, competence. How does this intense system impact students' sense of being effective, of feeling capable?
The Gaokao, with its standardized format, the intense competition, and the incredibly high stakes, it can really undermine students' sense of competence. And this is particularly true because of the enormous emphasis on getting a college degree in China.
It's seen as the key to a successful life.
Exactly. It's tied to social mobility, financial security, pretty much everything. And because college enrollment has expanded significantly in recent years, more and more students are being funneled towards the Gaokao, even if a traditional university education might not actually be the best fit for them.
They might have different talents, different interests, but they're still being pushed towards this very narrow path.
Right, and this can lead to a lot of frustration and a diminished sense of competence. If they're not naturally inclined towards the specific subjects that are heavily emphasized on the Gaokao, they might start feeling like they're just not good enough, no matter how hard they try.
And that feeling, it's not just anecdotal. The research really backs this up, right?
Oh, absolutely. Studies have shown that a significant percentage of students report feeling like they lack a sense of achievement, like they're constantly exhausted and overwhelmed, even if they're getting good grades.
They're putting in all this effort, but they're not really experiencing a genuine sense of mastery, of feeling capable.
Exactly. And this can lead to a lot of negative emotions, frustration, fear of failure, even a tendency to avoid challenging tasks altogether.
Because it feels too risky.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Why put yourself out there if you're just going to fail anyway? And these negative feelings, they tend to get worse as students get closer to the Gaokao. A lot of high school students, they say they feel like their studies don't really reflect what they're capable of, and they wish they could be doing other things that they're actually good at. Some even develop a strong dislike for school. They say it's no use or too restrictive.
It's almost like the system is making them feel incompetent, even if they're objectively achieving at a high level.
That's a key point. It's not just about their actual performance, it's about their subjective experience of competence. And what's even more fascinating is that research has shown that Chinese students actually report lower levels of need satisfaction when it comes to competence compared to students in many other cultures, even though they perform very well on international assessments like PISA.
That's counterintuitive. I mean, if they're getting such high scores, wouldn't you expect them to feel more competent?
You would, right. But there are a few possible explanations for this. First, the PISA samples might not be fully representative. They often focus on more developed urban areas, which might skew the results. Second, even if students are objectively competent in those specific areas measured by PISA, they might still feel a lack of competence within the incredibly competitive and pressure cooker environment of the Gaokao.
So even if they're getting good grades, they don't necessarily feel competent.
Exactly. And third, some researchers believe that those high PISA scores might actually reflect an over-reliance on rote memorization and test-taking skills rather than a deep understanding of the material. Remember, students in Shanghai also report the highest average weekly time spent on homework. It's almost double the international average.
So it could be more about quantity than quality. They're putting in a huge amount of effort, but it's not necessarily translating into a genuine sense of mastery and competence.
That's the key takeaway. Now let's turn our attention to the third core need, relatedness. How does the Gaokao system affect students' ability to form and maintain meaningful relationships with their peers, with their families?
In a system that's so focused on individual achievement and competition, it's hard to imagine that relatedness is really being nurtured.
And that's precisely what the research shows. The Gaokao, with its cutthroat competition and the sheer amount of time it demands, can be incredibly isolating. Studies have shown that a large percentage of adolescents in China actually report feeling lonely and lacking close connections.
And while pressure from parents and teachers definitely plays a role, the Gaokao itself seems to contribute to this social isolation.
Absolutely. I mean, when you're spending almost all your time studying, there's not much room left for friendships, for building those strong social bonds that are so crucial during adolescence.
Right, there's that saying, no time for friendship, which is heartbreaking when you think about it.
It really is. And it's not just the time factor. The whole competitive atmosphere that's created by the Gaokao can actually directly harm their sense of relatedness.
Like, it pits them against each other, right?
Exactly. You'll see motivational banners in schools with messages like, increase your score by 1 point, eliminate thousands of competitors. It creates this me versus them mentality, which is not really conducive to forming genuine connections.
It's almost like everyone is a potential threat rather than a potential friend.
It can feel that way. And this competition, it can create these really difficult internal conflicts for students. On the one hand, they want to have close friendships, but on the other hand, they're constantly being told that they need to outperform their peers.
It's like they're being pulled in two different directions.
Exactly. And unfortunately, parents and teachers sometimes inadvertently reinforce this competition. They might compare students' scores, even encourage them to identify a rival to try and surpass.
Which is kind of ironic, because in a system that emphasizes respect for teachers and elders, you'd think there would be more emphasis on collaboration and mutual support.
It is an interesting contradiction. And then you have the whole issue of how the Go-Cow system treats lower performing students.
Right, those who don't fit neatly into this picture of academic excellence.
Exactly. Because the system is so heavily based on rankings, students who don't perform well on the Gaokao are often stigmatized. They might be seen as a burden, even ostracized by their peers.
Like their lower scores are somehow reflecting badly on the school or the class as a whole,
It can feel that way. They might be seated in the back of the classroom, put in separate classes, even actively discouraged from forming friendships with higher achieving students.
which only adds to their feeling of isolation and incompetence,
Right.
right? It's a vicious cycle.
Absolutely. And when you consider all of this, the impact on autonomy, competence, and relatedness, well, it paints a pretty worrying picture of the overall psychological well-being of students in this system.
Given all the pressure they're under, it's hard to imagine that they're thriving emotionally.
And the research confirms this. Studies have consistently shown a decline in the subjective well-being of students as they get closer to the Gaokao. There's an increase in negative emotions like anxiety, depression, and loneliness, and a decrease in positive emotions. Their overall life satisfaction goes down.
They're essentially sacrificing their well-being for the sake of achievement.
In a way, yes, and a large part of their stress comes from this constant feeling of being controlled, both internally and externally. They have these incredibly high expectations placed upon them by their parents, their teachers, and society as a whole. They're terrified of failing, of disappointing everyone. And by the time they reach that crucial final year of high school, their motivation is primarily driven by these external pressures, by this fear of negative consequences.
They're not studying because they want to learn. They're studying because they feel like they have to.
Exactly. And they often report using passive coping mechanisms, like trying to just ignore the stress rather than actively addressing it. And even younger children in the system, they show high levels of anxiety specifically related to exams. It's like this anxiety is being ingrained in them from a very young age. And sadly, there are some really concerning statistics about suicidal ideation and attempts among adolescents in China.
And at least part of that is linked to this intense academic pressure.
That's what the research suggests. And when you compare Chinese students to their peers in other countries, they consistently report higher levels of fear and anxiety related to their academic performance.
So there's a real human cost to this system. But to try and get a more complete picture, we also need to consider the other side of the argument. Are there any potential benefits to the Gaokao system? Are there any psychological arguments that could be made in its defense?
There are some arguments that people make, particularly in terms of student involvement and the structure that the system provides.
So even if we acknowledge the negative impacts, we also need to consider the potential positives.
Absolutely. We need to look at the whole picture. So the first argument is about student involvement. Research has consistently shown that Chinese students spend a lot more time on their schoolwork than students in many other countries. They have this incredible work ethic, this dedication to their studies.
It's almost like they're in training for an academic marathon.
It's a good analogy. They have these intense study strategies, they use these massive workbooks, and they just put in a huge amount of effort. Now, while this high level of involvement might be partly driven by those external pressures we talked about, some research has shown that even controlled motivation can sometimes contribute to better performance.
So even if they're not necessarily loving what they're doing, the sheer amount of effort they put in might still lead to positive results.
It's a possibility, and we also have to remember the cultural context. In China, there's a very strong emphasis on hard work, diligence, persistence. It's deeply ingrained in their culture, and it's reflected in their education system.
So it's not just about the Gaokao itself. It's also about these broader cultural values that emphasize effort and achievement.
Exactly. Now, the second argument in favor of the Gaokao is about structure. People argue that because the curriculum is so closely aligned with the content of the exam, it provides a very clear and structured learning path for students.
So there's less ambiguity, less room for interpretation. It's all very clearly defined.
Exactly. And some people argue that this is actually a good thing, that it provides the kind of clarity and focus that's sometimes lacking in more open-ended or student-centered educational approaches. There's a belief that this strong alignment between curriculum and assessment helps to ensure that students are actually learning the material that's considered important.
But didn't we say earlier that there are some problems with this close alignment, particularly in the Chinese language and literature subject?
Yes, there are definitely areas where this tight alignment can be problematic, where it might lead to an overemphasis on rote memorization and a lack of deeper understanding. But overall, the Chinese education system is generally seen as being more structured and aligned compared to systems that don't have such high-stakes national exams.
So we have these potential benefits, the high involvement and the structure. But the question is, do these benefits outweigh the costs? And are they really a direct result of the high-stakes testing system?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. Let's look at the structure argument first. While structure is definitely important in education, it doesn't have to come at the cost of autonomy.
You can have clear expectations and guidelines without being overly controlling.
Exactly. And research shows that the most effective educational environments are those that combine structure with autonomy support.
Where teachers provide clear guidance but also respect students' perspectives, their choices, their feelings.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between structure and freedom. And when it comes to involvement, the key is not just how much effort students are putting in, but why they're putting in that effort.
Quality over quantity.
Precisely. SDT research has shown that students who are motivated by intrinsic reasons, who genuinely enjoy learning and value what they're learning, they tend to have better outcomes in terms of their well-being, their academic performance, even their ethical behavior.
So it's not just about pushing them to work harder, it's about nurturing their intrinsic motivation.
Exactly. And when you have a system that's so focused on external rewards and punishments, it can really undermine that intrinsic motivation. It's like you're training them to be extrinsically motivated, which might not be the most sustainable or fulfilling approach in the long run. And even though there's this strong cultural emphasis on hard work and diligence in China, we have to be careful not to confuse that with the specific pressures created by the Gaokao system.
Right. Valuing hard work in general is not the same as forcing students to overwork themselves for the sake of a single exam.
Exactly. And the research shows that when people are driven by controlled motivation, even if they achieve good results, they often pay a price in terms of their well-being, their creativity, their overall satisfaction with life.
So the Gaokao might be producing high achievers, but at what cost?
That's a big question. Now, let's shift our focus to the people who are most directly involved in the students' lives, their parents and teachers. How are their roles and their own motivations shaped by this whole system?
I mean, they're operating within the same pressure cooker as the students, so it's hard to imagine that they're not affected by it.
Absolutely. Let's start with parents. Chinese parenting, it's very much influenced by traditional Confucian values, which emphasize hierarchy, obedience, and parental authority. So it's not uncommon for parents to be quite controlling, particularly when it comes to their children's education.
It's almost like they see it as their duty to push their children towards success, even if it means being strict or using pressure tactics.
That's a common perception. And there's this really strong emphasis on academic achievement. Disobedience or poor grades can be seen as a reflection on the family, a source of shame. So there's this huge pressure on parents to make sure their children succeed, and this pressure, it often gets passed down to the children.
And the Gaokao just amplifies everything.
Absolutely. It becomes this all-consuming goal, this measure of a child's worth. And parents often have these incredibly high expectations for their children's performance.
They want them to be the best, to get into the top universities, to have the best possible future. But as we saw with the Gaokao itself, high expectations without the right kind of support can actually backfire.
Exactly. SDT tells us that when parents are overly controlling, when their love and approval feel conditional on their children's achievements, it can really damage the child's sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. They might start feeling like they're never good enough, no matter how hard they try. And their motivation for learning might become entirely based on avoiding their parents' disappointment, rather than on a genuine interest in the subject matter.
It's like they're constantly trying to earn their parents' love through their grades.
It can feel that way. And this dynamic, it often leads to a deterioration in the parent-child relationship. There's less open communication, more conflict, more resentment. It's a lose-lose situation.
And it seems like a lot of parents are actually aware of this, right? They know it's not healthy, but they feel trapped.
Exactly. They understand that the system is putting a lot of pressure on their children, but they feel like they have no other choice. There's this phrase in Chinese, "mai banfa," which means there's no other way. It really captures that feeling of being stuck, of having to play by the rules of the system, even if you don't agree with them. And interestingly, a lot of parents are actually struggling with their own need for autonomy.
They might have their own unfulfilled dreams, their own regrets, and they might be projecting those onto their children.
That's a real possibility. And there's also this huge social pressure to have high achieving children. It's like a status symbol. So you have parents pushing their children, but they're also being pushed by the system, by their own peers, by society as a whole.
It's like this giant pressure cooker, and everyone is feeling the heat. Now, what about teachers? How do they navigate this system?
Well, traditionally, teachers in China are seen as authority figures. They're highly respected, and their role is not just to impart knowledge, but to shape character, to instill values. And while that can be a positive thing, it also means that there's often a strong emphasis on obedience and conformity in the classroom.
It's less about encouraging critical thinking and more about following the rules, doing what you're told.
That's a common observation. And punishments, they're often seen as an acceptable way to enforce those rules. Now, in more developed urban areas, you might see less of the extreme physical punishments that were once common, but there's still a lot of pressure on teachers to get results. And that pressure, it often translates into a very controlled and test-oriented teaching style.
Where the focus is on preparing students for the Gaokao, even at the expense of other important aspects of their development.
Exactly. The curriculum becomes very narrow, the teaching methods become more traditional, more lecture-based, less interactive, and there's not a lot of attention paid to students' emotional well-being, their individual needs, their unique interests.
It's like the system is squeezing the joy out of learning, both for the students and for the teachers.
It can feel that way. And, some people argue that this test-oriented approach is actually a good thing. They say it provides clarity, it ensures that teachers are actually teaching the material that's considered important.
But couldn't you achieve that alignment without resorting to such controlling methods?
Absolutely. Remember, the most effective teachers are those who can balance structure with autonomy support. They set clear expectations, but they also create a space for students to be curious, to explore, to develop their own understanding of the material.
It's about fostering a love for learning, not just a fear of failing.
Exactly. And of course, teachers are under a lot of pressure themselves. They're evaluated based on their students' performance, so they're constantly being pushed to get those high scores. They often feel like they have no choice but to teach to the test, to use those controlling methods, even if they know it's not the ideal way to teach.
So it's this whole interconnected system, right? Everyone is feeling the pressure. Everyone is being shaped by the Gaokao, even the teachers. Which brings us to the question of educational reform. There have been attempts to change this system, haven't there?
Oh, absolutely. There have been several major reform efforts over the past few decades, each with the goal of making the system more holistic, more student-centered.
Oh.